I still remember the way the ocean wind hit me that afternoon, sharp with salt and just cold enough to make me pull my jacket closer. Malibu looked like a painting you could never quite afford. Cliffs crumbling into waves, sunlight turning the water to liquid silver. But I wasn't there for the view. I was there for a job. One that, if I'm honest, I wasn't sure I wanted. Grant Walker's house sat at the very top of the hill, behind gates taller than most buildings I'd ever lived in. I'd seen his name in real estate magazines, the king of glass towers, the kind of man who could turn a patch of dirt into $1 billion skyline. I imagined someone like that wouldn't even notice the person pouring his coffee, let alone the nanny he was hiring. When the gates opened, the car I'd borrowed from a friend crawled up a driveway that seemed to go on forever. The mansion appeared in pieces, first the edge of a roof, then walls of glass reflecting the Pacific. By the time I parked in front of the entrance, I could already feel it. This was a place designed to impress, not to live in. The front door opened before I even knocked. A man in a suit, not Grant, someone older, stood there. His voice was polite but distant. "Mr. Walker is expecting you. Follow me." Inside, the house was silent in the way hospitals are silent. Everything gleamed. Marble floors, white walls, art that looked like it belonged in a museum. No toys, no family photos, just emptiness. He led me into a study where Grant Walker sat behind a desk the size of my first apartment. He didn't stand to greet me, just looked up, dark eyes assessing like I was a property he might buy or reject on the spot. "Miss Lane?" His voice was low, controlled. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "You've read the file on my sons?" "I have." He pushed a thick binder across the desk toward me. "That's the updated care protocol. Medication schedules, physical therapy exercises, approved activities. You'll follow it exactly. No improvisation, no experiments." I glanced at the pages. Charts, diagrams, lists. It was the kind of plan that might keep a machine running smoothly. But I wasn't here for machines. "I understand," I said, even though I didn't. Grant's jaw tightened, like he'd already guessed I might not follow every rule. "I've been through 17 specialists, 9 therapists, and 5 nannies in the past 3 years. My sons require stability, not hope." He said the word hope like it was something dangerous. The interview didn't last much longer. He didn't ask about my childhood, my experience with kids beyond what was on paper, or why I'd even applied. By the time he stood and shook my hand, it felt less like I'd been hired and more like I'd been enlisted. A woman in her 60s, dressed in a crisp uniform, met me outside the study. "I'm Mrs. Harding," she said, her smile tight but warmer than anyone else's so far. "I'll show you to the boys' room." We climbed a staircase so wide it could have been a road. At the end of a long hall, she opened a door and stepped aside. Ethan and Cole sat in matching chairs by the window, sunlight spilling over them like it was trying to wake them up. They were 4, maybe 5. Dark hair like their father, but their eyes. There was no spark. Their legs dangled still, as if the muscles had forgotten they existed. "They're good boys," Mrs. Harding whispered beside me. "Just quiet." I took a step toward them, but they didn't look at me, didn't even blink. In that moment, I understood the silence of the house. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of life. And standing there, in that perfect, sterile room, with 2 little boys who had never taken a step, and a father who seemed afraid of even the idea of change, I felt something settle in my chest. I didn't know if I could fix anything here, but I knew I couldn't just follow a binder and watch them fade further into that stillness. I smiled anyway, the kind of smile you give before you've earned trust. "Hi, Ethan." "Hi, Cole. My name's Claire. I think we're going to be friends." Neither of them moved. but I could have sworn, just barely, that Cole's eyes flicked toward the banjo case sticking out of my bag. Mrs. Harding didn't notice, but I did. And in that tiny, almost invisible moment, I felt the first thread of a plan begin to weave itself in my mind. Mrs. Harding had barely finished introducing me before she excused herself, mumbling something about preparing dinner. The door clicked shut, and suddenly it was just me and them, the twins I'd read about in medical reports, but had never seen in person. Ethan sat with his chin propped on one small hand, eyes fixed on the ocean beyond the glass. Cole's gaze was lower, somewhere on the carpet, unfocused. If it weren't for the rise and fall of their chests, you might have thought they were carved from porcelain. I crouched down so we were at the same level. "Hi," I said softly. No answer. Not even a flicker. I'd been warned about this. Limited engagement, the file had called it. But paper doesn't prepare you for the weight of it in real life. 2 boys under 5 who had never taken a step, never chased each other down a hallway, never known the thrill of running just because you could. I glanced toward my bag, half hidden near the door. The neck of my banjo case stuck out just enough to catch the light. I hadn't planned to use it so soon, but something in the stillness pushed me. Slowly, I unzipped the case. The scent of worn wood and steel strings rose up like a memory. My grandfather's hands had touched this instrument for decades, his fingers coaxing melodies that made even the most stubborn neighbor crack a smile. He used to tell me, "Music isn't just sound, Claire. It's a key. Sometimes it unlocks things nothing else can." I sat cross-legged on the floor and plucked a single note. The sound was warm, round, and soft enough not to startle. Nothing from Ethan, nothing from Cole. So I added another, then another. A simple rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. I wasn't looking at the strings, I was watching them. Ethan's head shifted almost imperceptibly, like he was trying to catch something in the air. Cole's foot twitched. Barely a movement, but there. I kept the beat light, playful, letting it drift around the room. "This one," I murmured, more to myself than to them, "is from when I was your age." My fingers found the old Appalachian tune my grandfather used to play on summer nights when the fireflies came out. Cole blinked, slow, deliberate. Then, almost shyly, he looked up. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he turned away again. The door creaked. I looked up to see Grant in the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching. His expression was unreadable, part curiosity, part something harder. "I thought I made it clear," he said evenly. "No improvisation." I closed the case halfway, my heart picking up. "Just introducing myself," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. His gaze flicked from me to the boys, then back. If he noticed Cole's faint blush or Ethan's slight lean in my direction, he didn't mention it. "Dinner in 30 minutes, he said, and walked away. The moment he was gone, the room felt heavier. I zipped the banjo back up, but in my mind, the decision was already made. The file, the protocols, the rigid schedules, they weren't enough. These boys needed more than therapy sessions and medical charts. They needed connection, joy, a reason to try, and maybe, just maybe, this old banjo could be the key my grandfather had promised. I stood, slinging the case over my shoulder. "Tomorrow," I whispered to the boys, though I wasn't sure they could hear me, "we'll play again." Ethan's gaze stayed on the ocean. Cole's eyes followed me to the door. And in that tiny acknowledgement, I felt the first crack in the wall between us. I didn't know how much time I'd have before Grant shut me down completely, but I knew this. Whatever happened next, I'd have to be careful, quiet, and very, very deliberate. Because sometimes, the most incredible changes start with the smallest, most secret acts, The next morning, I arrived in the twins' room with the banjo in one hand and two bright red plastic spoons in the other. Mrs. Harding raised an eyebrow as she followed me in with their breakfast trays. "What are those for?" she asked. "Percussion," I said with a small smile. "Trust me." She didn't. Not entirely, but she set the trays down and stayed to watch. Ethan and Cole were where they always were. Ethan in his chair by the window, Cole on the floor cushion. Their expressions were as blank as yesterday. But I knew better now. Stillness didn't mean nothing was happening. I knelt between them and set the spoons down. "Okay, gentlemen," I said lightly. "We're going to try something different today. You don't have to walk. You don't have to stand. Just listen." The first few notes rang out, soft and steady, like a calm knock on a door you hoped someone would open. I tapped the spoons gently against my knee, letting the rhythm seep into the air. Then I paused, held out one spoon toward Ethan. He didn't move, so I leaned closer, caught his gaze, and tapped the spoon on the armrest of his chair. Once, twice. On the third tap, something shifted in his face. Curiosity. I pressed the handle into his hand. Cole was easier. I placed the other spoon in his palm, guided his fingers to wrap around it. Then, with exaggerated cheer, I tapped my spoon on the banjo's wooden body. Cole followed, his first strike hesitant, the next a little louder. It wasn't music. Not yet. But it was sound they were making, sound they controlled. "Now we're a band," I told them. "Breakfast will be the audience." Mrs. Harding made a sound halfway between a laugh and a scoff, but she stayed by the door. We kept it simple. I played short, bouncy tunes, old Appalachian folk songs, the kind my grandfather swore could shake the dust off a soul. Between verses, I had them tap their spoons on the trays, the chair arms, even the floor. Halfway through, it happened. Cole laughed. It wasn't loud, more like a surprised breath that had sound in it. But it was enough to make Mrs. Harding straighten in shock. "Did you hear?" she started, but I lifted a finger to my lips. If we acted like it was rare, he might retreat. So I just kept playing, grinning like this was the most normal thing in the world. Ethan's mouth twitched, the kind of almost smile you have to look for to believe. By the end of breakfast, they were tapping in time with each other. Not perfect, but together. When Mrs. Harding took the trays, she lingered in the doorway. "I've been here since they were born," she said quietly. "I've never seen them like that." I didn't answer right away, because part of me was still absorbing it too, the way a simple rhythm had drawn them out, even for a few minutes. After she left, I stayed on the floor with the boys. "You know," I said softly, "this is just the start. We can do this again later, maybe even better." They didn't reply, of course, but when I stood, Cole tapped his spoon twice against the floor. It was the smallest of gestures, and yet, it felt like a promise. That night, alone in my room, I replayed the morning in my mind. I thought about the binder full of rigid routines, and about the man who had handed it to me with that warning in his voice. Grant Walker wanted structure, the twins needed connection. I'd have to give them both, but in my own way. By the third morning, I could sense a shift in the air, before we even started. Ethan sat a little more upright, his eyes flicking toward the banjo case the moment I stepped into the room. Cole leaned forward on his cushion, palms resting flat against the floor like he was waiting for something to happen. We began with the spoons again. Simple, familiar. I kept the tempo slow, watching their bodies for signs most people wouldn't notice. That's when I saw it. Ethan's toes moved. Just the faintest curl, like a breeze had passed through them. It wasn't much, but for a child whose feet rarely responded to anything, it was a spark. Cole had his own way of answering. Each time I changed the rhythm, his upper body swayed ever so slightly. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but the more I varied the beat, the more his movement matched it. Good, I murmured, letting the word float in the space between us. You're listening. And suddenly, I was somewhere else. I was back in my grandfather's living room in Kentucky, the air thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and cedar. He was sitting in his old recliner, both legs wrapped in heavy braces from an injury overseas. The doctors had told him he'd never walk without crutches again, but every evening he'd lay those crutches aside, pick up the banjo, and tap his feet to the beat. One tap became two. Weeks later, he could lift his heel. Then, with a stubborn grin, he'd push himself to stand, balancing just long enough to strum a chord like it was a victory march. He used to tell me, movement isn't just in the muscles, Claire. It's in the memory of the body. You just have to remind it. That memory was why I was here, breaking every unspoken rule in Grant Walker's protocol. I didn't realize we had an audience until the music slowed and a shadow moved across the doorway. Grant stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting against the frame. For a moment, I thought, maybe he sees it. The way Ethan's toes curl, the way Cole leans into the rhythm. Maybe he'll understand. But when our eyes met, his expression was unreadable. He glanced at his watch, then said, I'll be working from the home office today. No comment on what he'd just witnessed. No sign he cared at all. Still, over the next week, I noticed things. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway in the middle of the day, the low murmur of his voice on calls, drifting down from upstairs instead of from some high-rise downtown. He was here more often, and while he never joined us, I caught glimpses. Grant pausing by the slightly open door, just long enough to hear a verse or two before moving on. I didn't press him. Change was coming in small reactions, not grand gestures. Ethan's curling toes, Cole's tilted head, and maybe, just maybe, the way their father lingered a little longer each time. I told myself it was enough for now, because the truth was, I had a feeling the day would come when Grant wouldn't just watch from the shadows. He'd see something he couldn't ignore. And when that happened, nothing in this house would be the same again. The rain that afternoon came in sideways, needling against the windows like it was trying to get in. Malibu doesn't get many storms, but when it does, the whole coastline feels smaller, closer, like the ocean is folding in on itself. Inside the living room, the twins and I had made our own little world, banjo leaning against the coffee table, a pile of couch cushions on the floor, and the steady beat of a children's marching song pulsing from the small speaker I'd hidden behind a plant. Okay, soldiers, I teased, my voice light. Today's mission, touch the flag. The flag was a throw pillow propped on the sofa. Ethan was on one side, Cole on the other, both gripping the armrests like climbers on a cliff. We'd been working up to this all week, first learning to shift their weight from one leg to the other, then holding themselves upright for longer than a few seconds. On 3, I said. 1, 2. They didn't wait for 3. Cole lunged first, his knees trembling but locking just enough to hold him. Ethan followed, teeth clenched, every muscle in his face working to keep his balance. I was close enough to catch them if they fell, but I didn't have to. For those few seconds, they stood. Not holding on to me, not strapped into braces. Just standing. Good. That's it. I clapped, keeping my voice steady so they wouldn't sense the lump in my throat. Now, tap the flag. Cole reached out with one small hand, his fingers brushing the pillow. Ethan copied him. They both grinned. Quick, flashing smiles that looked almost like mischief. That's when I felt it. That prickle at the back of your neck when you're being watched. I turned my head. Grant was in the doorway. No suit jacket this time, just a dark sweater, his hair damp from the rain. His eyes were locked on his son's, and for once, they weren't cold. They were searching. like he was trying to memorize what he was seeing in case it vanished. I didn't speak. Neither did he. The only sound was the tinny drumbeat from the speaker and the soft thud of the boy's bare feet shifting against the rug. Ethan's knees buckled first. I caught him under the arms before he slid all the way down. Cole dropped to the cushion with a breathless laugh. When I glanced back toward the doorway, Grant was still there. But something in his face had shuddered again. He straightened, the moment gone as quickly as it had come. "I didn't know you were home," I said quietly. "I came back early," he replied, voice even. The meeting was canceled. I waited for the lecture, for the reminder about the protocol, the rules, the dangers of pushing too hard. It didn't come. Instead, he just stood there a second longer, looking at the twins. His gaze lingered on Ethan's flushed cheeks, Cole's little fist still clutching the edge of the sofa. Then he said, "Carry on," and turned away. The boys didn't notice his exit. They were too busy catching their breath, their eyes bright in a way I'd never seen before. But I noticed. I noticed the way he had stepped into that room and, for a split second, looked like a man seeing his children for the first time in years. And I knew. He could pretend all he wanted, but what he'd seen was going to stay with him. Something changed after that rainy afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. Grant didn't rush into the room the next day asking for a full explanation. He didn't thank me or admit he'd seen something worth breaking his own rules for. But there were subtle shifts, the kind you only notice if you're looking for them. The first was breakfast. Usually, Mrs. Harding served the twins upstairs while Grant left early for the city. But now, every so often, I'd catch him lingering in the kitchen, coffee in hand, as if he just happened to be there when we walked in. He'd ask the boys how they slept, even if they didn't answer. Then his eyes would flick to me, like he was checking if I'd noticed him trying. The second was the hallway pauses. More than once I heard his footsteps slow outside the playroom. He'd stand just beyond the doorway, far enough that he could retreat without being seen, but close enough to catch a snippet of music or a burst of laughter. And then there were the questions. Small ones, dropped into conversation as though they were afterthoughts. How long can Ethan stay upright before his legs give? Does Cole seem to favor one side? Are you tracking their progress anywhere? Each time I'd answer carefully, honest, but not so enthusiastic that he'd feel cornered. He was a man testing the water with one toe, afraid of finding it too cold. But I also saw something else in him, a kind of tension that had nothing to do with business. It was the tightrope between hope and the fear of watching it collapse. I recognized it because I'd seen it before, on my mother's face when my grandfather first tried to walk again. She wanted to believe, but belief was dangerous. Belief meant you had something to lose. For Grant, hope wasn't free. It came with the risk of heartbreak. And for a man who'd already buried his wife and been told his sons would never walk, heartbreak was a currency he couldn't afford to spend again. Still, I could feel him inching closer to the edge. One afternoon, while the boys were napping, I found him in the sunroom, scrolling through his phone. Without looking up, he said, "That song you play? The one with the fast picking." "What's it called?" I told him. He nodded once, like he was filing it away, then went back to his phone. But when I left the room, I heard the faint sound of him humming it under his breath. That night, lying in my own bed, I thought about those small openings, those cracks in the armor. If he was willing to let hope in, even in these tiny doses, maybe I could give it more to feed on. But that meant pushing the twins further, beyond standing, beyond tapping to a rhythm, into something that would make it impossible for Grant, or anyone, to pretend it was just coincidence. It was risky. One wrong step, one injury, and I could be out the door before I had the chance to explain. But the alternative was worse, letting those boys plateau because I was too afraid to challenge them. I decided the next session wouldn't be just about holding their weight. We'd try moving, shifting from one foot to the other, maybe even a step if they felt brave. If it worked, it would be a breakthrough. If it didn't, well, I might be packing my bags by the end of the week. Either way, I knew one thing. Sometimes, the only way to make someone believe in a miracle is to let them see it happen with their own eyes. I'd been planning the exercise all morning. The boys had been steady for nearly a minute at a time lately, their legs trembling but holding. Today, I wanted to build on that. Have them shift their weight from one foot to the other while holding onto the back of the sofa. The rain from last week had given way to bright, slanting sunlight. It spilled across the living room floor in warm stripes, and I told myself it was a good omen. "All right, team," I said, positioning Ethan and Cole side by side, each gripping the sofa's edge. "We're going to march in place. Just a tiny step, left, then right. I'll be right here." Cole's brow furrowed in concentration, but he lifted his left foot, set it down. Ethan copied him, a little slower. "Good," I encouraged. "Now the other side." Ethan's right foot caught on the edge of the rug. It happened so fast. One moment he was upright, the next his knees buckled, and his whole body pitched forward. I lunged to grab him, but my fingers brushed his sleeve just as he slipped sideways to the floor. Cole's eyes went wide, and then the sound came. A sharp, panicked cry that cut straight through me. He clung to the sofa, his spoon-like toy clattering to the ground. Before I could pick Ethan up, I heard the heavy footsteps. Grant's voice was in the doorway before he was. "What the hell is going on?" I straightened. Ethan still in my arms. He lost his footing, but he's fine. "Fine?" Grant's tone was sharp enough to slice the air. "You're letting them stand without braces? Without me here? Do you have any idea what could happen?" I could feel Ethan trembling against my chest, more from the shock than pain. "It was controlled," I tried to explain. "I was right here. He didn't hit his head. They need to try. They need stability." He cut in, his voice low now, but no less dangerous. "Not your experiments. I told you. No improvisation." The twins were silent again, Cole's eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. The joy and progress of the past week felt like it was draining out of the room, replaced by something colder, heavier. I eased Ethan back into his chair, kneeling so we were eye level. "You're okay," I whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. His breathing slowed, but the tension in his shoulders stayed. When I turned back to Grant, he was standing rigid, hands in his pockets like he was holding himself back from pacing. "You're done for today," he said finally. "No more. Whatever this was." He left without waiting for me to answer, the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall echoing in the silence. I stayed on the floor a moment longer, one hand on each boy's knee, grounding them. Inside, a knot of frustration and fear twisted tighter. This was the risk I'd known I was taking. One slip, and all the trust I'd been building could vanish. But as I watched Ethan glance at Cole, as if to silently check if his brother was all right, I knew the answer to the question Grant had thrown at me without asking. Yes, I knew what could happen. But I also knew what wouldn't happen if we stopped now. Nothing. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The house was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace, more like the air before a storm. Dinner had been tense. Grant didn't speak, and the boys picked at their food without looking at me. I cleaned up slowly, half hoping the silence would dissolve on its own. It didn't. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when I heard his voice from the doorway. "We need to talk." He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked toward the study. I dried my hands and followed. The study felt different at night. The ocean view was just a black expanse now, the glass reflecting the warm light from the desk lamp. Grant was standing by the shelves, one hand resting on a framed photograph of the twins as toddlers. Their mother was in the picture too, her smile soft, her arms around them like she could shield them from anything. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Why did you ignore the protocol?" I took a slow breath. I didn't ignore it. I expanded it. That got his attention. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Expanded it?" I nodded. "The therapy in that binder is good, but it's mechanical. It's about muscle groups and nerve responses. And yes, that matters. But it's missing something." He crossed his arms. "And you think you know what that is?" "I know what worked for my grandfather," I said, my voice steady. "He came back from the war with his legs so damaged they told him he'd never walk again. But every night, he'd play the banjo and tap his feet to the beat. At first, it was nothing, just movement for the sake of movement. But little by little, his body remembered what it had forgotten." Grant's gaze softened for a second, then hardened again. "That's anecdotal, not medicine." "Maybe," I said. "But it gave him a reason to try. And I see the same thing in your boys. They need a reason. Something joyful. Something that makes them forget they're even trying. That's when the progress happens." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Not in anger, but in thought. "You realize what could have happened today if you'd been wrong? If Ethan had hit his head? If Cole had fallen too?" "I do," I admitted. "But I also realize what will happen if we don't push them. Nothing. No change. Just years of the same routines while they slip further into believing they can't do more." He looked away, back at the photograph on the shelf. His jaw tightened, but his shoulders seemed less rigid than they had all day. Finally, he turned back. "You have 1 week." I blinked. 1 week? 1 week to show me something that justifies the risk you're taking, he said. "If I don't see undeniable progress, we go back to the binder. No exceptions." It wasn't approval, but it wasn't a shut door either. I nodded. 1 week. He stepped past me toward the door, then paused. "Claire." "Yes?" His voice was quieter now. "If you fail, I can't watch them lose hope. Not again." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound like a promise I couldn't guarantee. After he left, I stood in the middle of that study, staring at the dark glass and my own reflection in it. 1 week. 7 days to make him believe. 7 days to prove to him, and maybe to myself, that I wasn't wrong to trust the smallest signs. I didn't know how we were going to do it yet, but I knew we would. Because if I'd learned anything from my grandfather, it was this. Sometimes belief doesn't come from the result. It comes from the trying. The next morning, I woke up with a plan and the kind of nervous energy that makes your hands move faster than your head. The living room was going to be our arena. I pushed the heavy coffee table against the wall, rolled up the rug, and laid down a soft foam mat across the hardwood floor. The space felt different now. Less like a showroom and more like a place something could actually happen. From the toy chest in the corner, I picked a small, bright blue ball. It was lightweight, easy to grip, and just bouncy enough to keep the boys interested. I placed it in the center of the mat and stepped back to look at the room. It wasn't complicated, but I knew this setup could be the thing that tipped the balance. The twins came in after breakfast, Mrs. Harding following with that look that was equal parts curiosity and worry. Ethan's eyes went straight to the ball. Cole tilted his head like he was trying to figure out what I was up to. "All right, gentlemen," I said with a grin. "Today we're playing a new game. It's called Race to the Ball. The rules are simple. When I say go, you stand up, reach the ball, and whoever gets it first wins." Cole frowned. "What do we get if we win?" It was the first spontaneous question he'd ever asked me, and it caught me off guard. I crouched down so we were eye level. Winner gets to pick the next song I play. That seemed to register. Ethan gave a tiny nod, and I could feel the shift. They weren't thinking about therapy or rules. They were thinking about winning. I helped them into position, each holding on to the low edge of the sofa for balance. Their knees wobbled, but I kept my hands close without actually touching them. Ready? I called. 3, 2, go! Ethan lunged first, his fingers tightening on the sofa edge before he let go for a split second to shift forward. Cole hesitated, then pushed himself upright, taking a half step that almost sent him off balance. For a heartbeat, the room was all motion, tiny legs working harder than they'd ever had to, faces flushed with effort, the ball sitting just out of reach like a prize at the end of a long road. That's when I felt it. The awareness that we weren't alone. I glanced toward the archway. Grant was there. No suit, no phone in hand, just standing, his gaze locked on his son's. There was no calculation in his expression this time, no guarded skepticism, just focus, and maybe hope. Ethan reached the ball first, dropping to his knees with a triumphant laugh. Cole followed a second later, collapsing onto the mat beside his brother. Both were breathless, but their eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen before. Looks like Ethan wins, I said, clapping softly. What song's it going to be? He thought for a moment. The one with the fast picking. I smiled, recognizing the tune he meant. It was the same one Grant had asked about days ago. I started to reach for the banjo when I caught Grant's eyes across the room. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could tell he'd noticed what had just happened, the way his boys had stood, however shakily, because they wanted to, not because they were told to. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was working against him. I felt like we might be on the same side. The blue ball was still in Ethan's hands when I set it back on the mat. I could feel the air in the room change, like something invisible was leaning forward, waiting to see what would happen next. Let's try again, I said, my voice soft but sure. This time, no race. Just see if you can come to me. I moved back a few feet, kneeling so my eyes were level with theirs. My palms were open, inviting. Ethan glanced at the sofa behind him, then at me. His fingers flexed against the fabric for a moment, as if weighing his options. And then, in one motion, he let go. His knees wobbled. His arms lifted instinctively for balance. I could see every muscle in his small body fighting gravity. But his eyes stayed locked on mine. One step, I encouraged. He shifted his weight forward. His right foot slid, caught, and planted. Then the left. Not smooth, not steady. But it was forward. A sound came from behind me, quiet but sharp, like someone had just forgotten to breathe. I didn't have to turn to know it was Grant. 2 steps, I said gently. Ethan moved again, slower this time, but with a strange determination. When he reached me, I caught him before his knees gave out, pulling him into a quick, steadying hug. Before I could let go, I felt another presence at my side. Cole, gripping his brother's shirt with one hand, had followed. He hadn't let go of Ethan the entire way, using him as an anchor. His face was flushed, but there was a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You both did it, I whispered, holding them steady. You stood. You walked. When I finally turned, Grant was still in the archway. His posture was rigid, but his eyes told a different story, wide, glassy, and fixed on his sons like he was trying to burn the moment into memory. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to add that wouldn't diminish what had just happened. Ethan leaned into me, catching his breath. Cole kept his small hand on his brother's arm, as if afraid to break the connection. I glanced at Grant again. For a second, I thought he might walk away without a word, the way he always did when the emotions got too close. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped into the room, crouched down in front of his sons, and rested a hand, tentatively, almost reverently, on each of their shoulders. "You walked," he said quietly, the words thick in his throat. Ethan nodded once. Cole just grinned. Grant looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived in this house, there was no barrier in his eyes. Just something raw, unguarded, and entirely human. That night, after the boys were asleep, I passed the living room and stopped short. Grant was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, rolling the blue ball back and forth between his palms. It was the same ball we'd used earlier. When he noticed me in the doorway, he didn't look away. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll be here for the next game." And he was. From that day on, he never just stood in the doorway to watch. He joined in, rolling the ball, clapping for every small victory, letting the boys pull him into their world. It wasn't just their first steps. It was his too. The change wasn't overnight, but it was fast enough that Mrs. Harding noticed before I did. One morning, I came downstairs to find Grant already in the kitchen, not in a suit, but in a plain t-shirt and jeans. He was pouring cereal into 3 bowls, one for each of the boys and one for himself. "They told me you usually start practice after breakfast," he said, sliding the bowls toward me like this was perfectly normal. That day, he followed us into the living room and didn't just sit in his usual chair. He knelt on the floor beside Ethan and Cole, picked up 2 wooden spoons from the toy bin, and began tapping them together in time with the song I was playing. At first, the boys stared at him, unsure if this was really their father or some version they'd never met. But then Ethan grinned, a quick, bright flash, and started clapping along. Cole, not to be outdone, grabbed his own spoon and joined in. The rhythm turned into a game, Grant tapping a pattern, the boys trying to copy it, me weaving in a melody on the banjo. For the first time, our practice felt less like therapy and more like a family band, off-key, but completely in sync. It didn't stop there. A few days later, I brought out the blue ball again. Before I could explain the rules, Grant scooped it up, tucked it under his arm, and crouched down. "All right, if you want it, you're gonna have to catch me," he teased. The boys froze for half a second, then erupted into laughter. Grant took off in a slow, exaggerated crawl across the mat, letting them grab at his sweater. When Cole managed to snag the ball, Grant fell backward dramatically, pretending to be defeated. Ethan laughed so hard he nearly tipped over. And then came the piggyback rides. It started as a way to reward them after a longer than usual standing session. "Climb on," Grant said, lowering himself to the mat. Ethan went first, wrapping his small arms around his father's neck. Grant stood carefully, walking slow circles around the room while Ethan's face lit up like the sun had come out just for him. Cole's turn was next, and he made it a competition. How many laps around the couch could they do before Grant needed a break? I lost count after 6, but by then the living room was echoing with the kind of laughter that had been missing since the day I walked into this house. Mrs. Harding leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching the scene with a soft smile. "Haven't heard that sound in a long time," she murmured. Neither had I. It wasn't just the boys changing. Grant was too. He still carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who ran empires, but in these moments, that weight seemed to fall away. He was just a dad, down on the floor with his kids, letting them win at games he could have easily dominated. By the end of the week, the house felt different, lighter. The silence that used to press in from every corner had been replaced with something warmer. Footsteps running down the hall, spoons clattering in playful battles, the off-key hum of 3 voices trying to remember the same song. And for the first time, I thought, maybe it's not just the twins learning to walk. Maybe we all are. It happened by accident. I'd been looking for extra blankets in the upstairs hallway closet, the one Mrs. Harding said was overflow storage. The door was stiff, the kind that sticks from years of not being opened, and when I finally managed to push it wide, I realized it wasn't a closet at all. It was a room. Not big, just enough for a desk and a small love seat. But every inch of wall space was covered in photographs. Her. The woman from the framed picture in Grant's study, only here she was frozen in 100 different moments, laughing with her head thrown back on a sailboat, holding the twins when they were still swaddled in blankets, standing in front of a Christmas tree, her eyes lit with the kind of joy that makes you believe in it. There were other things, too. Her scarf draped over the back of a chair, a coffee mug with a faded floral pattern, a worn leather-bound journal stacked neatly on the desk. The air was faintly scented with something floral, like it had been trapped here all these years. I stepped inside before I could think better of it. That's when I heard his voice. "You found it." I turned. Grant was leaning against the doorframe, his face unreadable but not angry. He glanced past me into the room, then stepped inside, his gaze traveling over the photographs as if he were seeing them for the first time. "I haven't brought anyone in here since the funeral," he said quietly. I didn't move. "She looks happy?" I offered. "She was," he said, a faint smile ghosting across his face. "Happiest person I'd ever met. She had this way of making everything feel lighter, even the hard stuff." His eyes landed on a picture of her holding Ethan and Cole in matching onesies. She believed they'd be fine, even after the diagnosis. I told her we had to be realistic, but she never stopped talking to them like they'd run around the yard one day. He swallowed hard, his voice catching. When she died, it was like the part of me that could believe in that died with her. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with the weight of what he was sharing. I realized this was the first time he'd ever spoken about her directly to me. "I'm sorry," I said. He shook his head. "Don't be. I kept this room closed because I thought it would hurt less. But the truth is, it just kept me stuck. Every photo in here is a day I can't get back." He glanced at me then, really looked. "But lately, I've been thinking maybe she'd be angry with me for giving up so easily." I didn't know what to say, so I just met his gaze. Something shifted in that moment. Something that wasn't about the twins or therapy or rules. It was about trust. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just the nanny or the experimenter he'd reluctantly allowed into his home. I was someone he was willing to let see the cracks. When we left the room, he didn't close the door all the way, and that, more than anything he'd said, told me our relationship had just changed. 6 months. That's how long it had been since Ethan and Cole first let go of the sofa and took those shaky steps toward me. Now they were running, full, unrestrained laps around the backyard. The same yard that used to be nothing more than a place they watched from a window had become their racetrack, their battlefield, their stage. The sun was warm, the Malibu breeze carrying the faint scent of salt water up the hill. I leaned against the porch rail, watching them chase each other around the big oak tree, their laughter bouncing off the house. "Don't let him catch you, Ethan," I called out, and Ethan, cheeks flushed, hair damp with sweat, yelled back, "He won't," before darting left. Cole's giggles followed close behind. That's when I noticed the table on the patio. Covered in a red and white checkered cloth, it was set with paper plates, lemonade in mason jars, and a small chocolate cake with white frosting. Someone had written in careful loops, "You did it." Grant emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of sliders, the kind with melted cheese spilling over the edges. He caught my puzzled look and shrugged. "Thought we should celebrate." "A party?" I asked, smiling despite myself. "Just us," he said. "Family." The word hung in the air longer than I expected, and something warm settled in my chest. We gathered around the table when the boys finally wore themselves out, their sneakers streaked with grass stains. They clambered into their seats, still buzzing with energy, and Grant poured lemonade for everyone. "Before we eat," he said, "I want to say something." The boys straightened like they were about to hear one of his serious speeches, but his voice softened instead. "6 months ago, I didn't think I'd see this day, and I was wrong. You proved me wrong." He looked at me when he said the last part. Before I could respond, a familiar melody floated from the patio speakers. The twang of a guitar, the easy, steady rhythm of a country song I'd played for the boys more times than I could count. It wasn't a recording from my banjo. It was a full arrangement, rich and warm, but I recognized it instantly. "You found it," I said, a little surprised. "Had to call 3 different music stores," he admitted, "but I wanted the real thing. Seemed fitting." The boys started clapping along, and soon we were all laughing, the cake half-eaten, crumbs scattered across the tablecloth. There was no formality to it. No toasts, no speeches beyond that one short acknowledgement. Just music, sunlight, and the quiet kind of joy that comes when you realize you're no longer waiting for something bad to happen. Grant caught my eye across the table. His smile wasn't wide, but it was steady, certain. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just a celebration of the boys' progress. It was a celebration of what we'd all built here, something whole out of the broken pieces we'd started with. When the song ended, Ethan climbed into his father's lap. Cole followed, the 3 of them forming a tangle of arms and laughter. I turned away for a moment, giving them the privacy of the moment, but not before I saw Grant reach for his phone and snap a picture. The kind of picture that, I suspected, might end up framed in that once closed room upstairs. The house was quiet again after the boys finally went to bed, worn out from running and sugar. I was in the kitchen stacking plates from the patio when I heard his footsteps. Grant leaned against the doorway, his hands in his pockets. He didn't speak right away, just watched me for a moment like he was searching for the right entry point. "Can we talk?" he said at last. I nodded, drying my hands on a dish towel. He gestured toward the living room and we sat, him in the armchair, me on the sofa across from him. The soft hum of the ocean outside filled the space between us. "You remember the first week you were here?" he began, "when I came home early and found you with them?" I did. I could see it as clearly as if it were playing on the wall behind him, 2 boys standing on wobbly legs, my hands just inches away to catch them if they fell, the shock in his eyes. "I thought that was the incredible thing," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere past me. "Seeing them stand, seeing something I'd been told was impossible." His eyes came back to mine then, and his voice softened. "But I was wrong. That wasn't it. The incredible thing was that you made me believe in something beyond what I could see. You didn't just get them on their feet. You pulled me out of a place I didn't realize I'd been living in for years." I felt the air shift, heavier now, but in a way that made my heart beat faster. "I used to think the future was just something to get through," he continued. "A series of days to manage, problems to solve. Since my wife passed, I hadn't let myself picture anything ahead that wasn't empty." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You changed that. You made me want to picture something again. And in every version I see, you're in it." For a moment I couldn't find words. The hum of the ocean, the faint tick of the clock on the wall, everything felt amplified. "I want you to stay," he said, "not just as the boys' nanny, as part of our family, if you'll have us." The simplicity of it caught me off guard. No grand speech, no careful persuasion, just a truth laid bare. I looked at him then, really looked. The man who once stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, skeptical of everything I did, was now asking me to stay. And not because of duty or convenience, but because he'd let himself hope again. And that's when it hit me. I'd changed too. When I first took this job, I'd thought it would be a few months of work before moving on. A way to pay bills, maybe save up for whatever came next. But somewhere between the laughter in the living room, the blue ball races, and the late-night talks in the kitchen, this house had become something else entirely. Home. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to hold the moment as it was, still and unspoiled, before whatever came next. But I knew my answer. A year can pass quietly, or it can transform everything. Ours was the second kind. The Malibu air had that golden quality it gets in early summer, where even the shadows feel warm. Out in the yard, Ethan and Cole were kicking a soccer ball back and forth, their shouts carrying over the grass. They'd grown taller, faster, bolder, chasing the ball without a hint of hesitation, without remembering there was ever a time they couldn't run. From where I stood on the porch, I could see the determination on Ethan's face as he tried to dribble past his brother. Cole countered with a quick sidestep and stole the ball, laughing as he made for the makeshift goal we'd set up with 2 cones. The thud of the kick and the triumphant cheer that followed felt like the soundtrack to this new life. Behind me, I heard the soft clink of a mug being set down. Grant stepped up beside me, handing me a cup of coffee just the way I liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream. "They're getting good," he said, watching the boys with that steady half-smile I'd come to know so well. "They're unstoppable," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. He rested his hand lightly on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a year's worth of meaning, comfort, partnership, the quiet acknowledgement of all the days and nights that had led us here. The house behind us no longer felt like the cavernous, echoing place I'd walked into last year. It was lived in now, shoes scattered by the door, a faint hum of music from the kitchen speaker, walls decorated with the boys' artwork taped up alongside framed photos. Photos of us. Grant, Ethan, and Cole, grinning with their arms around each other at the beach. The boys mid-laugh with frosting on their noses at last month's birthday. A candid shot of me sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, banjo in hand, while the twins clapped along. I thought about how far we'd all come, how the boys had gone from struggling to stand to racing across the yard, how Grant had gone from keeping the world at arm's length to inviting me into the most private parts of his life, and how I, once planning to move on after a short contract, had stopped imagining a life anywhere else. "Never thought I'd say this," Grant said, eyes still on the boys, "but I like the noise now." I smiled into my coffee. It's the sound of life. Cole scored another goal, throwing his arms up like a pro. Ethan rolled his eyes but clapped for him anyway. I knew they'd be back at it in seconds, and I also knew they'd drag us into a match before the afternoon was over. Grant's hand stayed on my shoulder, warm and grounding. We didn't need to say anything more. The boys were out there living the proof of what we'd all built together. A year ago, this house was just walls and windows. Now, it was home. The afternoon game in the yard had ended the way they usually did. 2 sweaty boys sprawled on the grass, arguing over who really won, and Grant insisting it was a tie just to make them groan. By the time the sun dipped low, the house had settled into that calm, golden hour quiet. I was in the living room, dusting the shelves, when I noticed the banjo case in the corner. The same faded leather handle, the same scuffed edges. It had been with me since the day I first walked through the front door here. Back then, it was just my grandfather's old instrument, something I carried for comfort, and maybe for luck. Now, it was more than that. I opened the case and ran my fingers along the worn wood. The strings still held the faint memory of all those afternoons in the living room, the notes that had coaxed out the boys' first laughter, the rhythms that had given them their first reason to try. Grant stepped in quietly, coffee mug in hand. "You thinking of playing?" I shook my head. "Not this time." I'd been planning this for a while. In the corner of the room, we'd had a small glass front cabinet installed, part display, part memory box. Inside were pieces of our story. The blue ball from that first breakthrough game, the tiny sneakers the boys had outgrown, a photo of all of us the day they ran across the yard without stopping. I lifted the banjo from its case and placed it carefully inside the cabinet, right in the center. Grant watched me. "Looks like it belongs there." "It does," I said. "It's a reminder." He tilted his head. "Of what?" "That day," I said simply. "The first day I saw them smile, the day you saw something you didn't think was possible. It's not just a banjo. It's where we all started to believe again." He nodded slowly, and for a moment we both stood there, letting the weight of it settle in. The glass caught the warm light from the windows, making the banjo's wood glow like it was lit from within. The boys burst in then, still full of energy, tracking grass onto the carpet. Ethan stopped when he saw the cabinet. "You put it in there?" "Yep," I said. "Safe and sound, that way we'll always remember." Cole peered through the glass. "Remember what?" "That miracles aren't just things that happen out of nowhere," I told him. "They're built with love, trust, and a lot of patience." Ethan grinned. "And music." "Especially music," I agreed. Grant reached over and gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze, the kind of small, steady gesture that said everything without a single word. As the boys dashed off toward the kitchen, probably in search of dessert, I took one last look at the banjo behind the glass. It wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about honoring the moment that had changed all of us, not a miracle from the sky, but something better.